Hi, I'm Paul Stringfellow and welcome to another episode of CTO Insights. On this episode, we're going to be taking a look at how to get the best out of your cybersecurity investments. And to help me have that discussion, I'm joined by Stephan McKay from Sophos. Hi, Stephan. How are you doing?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Good to have you with me here today. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, thanks for coming on my show. I'm glad we're all here. Look, Stephen, before we jump into the topic, and thanks for your time today, because I appreciate you're a busy man, which is not helped by your CEO calling last minute calls ahead of us doing a podcast. So, but he's way more important than I am. So, in terms of your role and a little bit of an introduction to who you are and what you do, should we start there? That's a good place to start.
A good place as any. So, been at Sophos for 10 years. I look after our endpoint products and our XDR platform. I've been in the IT industry for around 20 years and just enjoy, solving those customer problems, building exciting products and working with lots of different teams.
Yeah. So, it's a really interesting part of the of the IT industry to be in cybersecurity. It's rapidly changing, it's rapidly evolving. And I think for people in those kind of areas of responsibility, so people in C-suite, head of IT, head of cybersecurity, security operations teams, it is a kind of a constant evolving, constant changing kind of challenge. So I mean, what are some of the, for our kind of C-suite viewers for this show, what are kind of some of the challenges that you're seeing on a very regular basis? What are the things that people are approaching you with saying, please help?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, started off looking after the endpoint products here at Sophos, and really we have a strong and still have an obsession with protection first. But the adversaries have moved on. Attacks are a lot more sophisticated, and something we call dwell time. So when an attack starts to when it finishes, and if we focus on ransomware, that dwell time is ever shortening. And so the big challenge is getting insight into that nefarious activity. And so the real challenge is around the data point. So endpoint is still really important. It's still central to what most C-suite, CISOs, etc. think about. How can I have good visibility into the activity that's happening on those user devices? Of course, we add in OT and IoT and the other devices in the network. There are other areas to focus on. But it's really about that visibility. How can I get early visibility that there might be something untoward happening? That's the first challenge. Once you have that visibility, what do you do with that visibility? How do you go and investigate to find out, is it actually nefarious, or did Stephen decide that he wanted to install some software on his device and went to a slightly dodgy website and downloaded an executable, or what he thought was the file he wanted? So the investigation is then really key. So how do you ascertain the signal from the noise? How do you get that signal and actually go and investigate and ascertain if there's something untoward happening? And then finally, we talked about this, the R in the EDR space is, how do you respond? How can I respond? And so they're the conversations we're having. But the other conversation is around who manages that, who manages the detection, who manages the investigation, and who manages the response. Because as I mentioned, the complexity of these threats means it's no longer something you can dip into. If I think back to when I started, the set and forget nature, I'll create my policies, I'll stop all the bad stuff or as much as I can. And every now and again, something will get flagged up to me and I'll go and ascertain Stephen downloaded something he shouldn't have, and I'll delete that file. It's been quarantined by my endpoint protection products, but I'll go and now remove it. And some of the more sophisticated teams, way back when, would have maybe done a search to see if that file was elsewhere within the estate. Nowadays, it's a 24/7 job. And the level of sophistication means you can no longer have people that are dipping in and out. They're no longer fixing the printer in the morning, helping with macros and spreadsheets in the afternoon, and then, part-time SOC before they clock off at the end of the day.
Yeah. And it's interesting that kind of, actually just with a couple of things you finished there, the idea of part-time SOC, so Security Operations Center, if anybody's watching, not sure what we mean by that, we don't mean SOCs. Because we wear socks all the time. But that, and actually the clocking off at the end of the day, because I think it's a really interesting challenge, that in that, of course, traditionally lots of businesses are kind of Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, 9 to 5:30, whatever, and their staff are as well. But of course, the cybersecurity threat is not Monday to Friday, 9 to 5:30. The cybersecurity, in fact, the cybersecurity threat is likely to be Monday to Friday, 5:31 to 8:59, because it's looking for those times. A cyber attacker is going to be looking for those times when you're not there, so they can, do a little bit of reconnaissance, can deploy their, malicious code, whatever that might be. So that kind of thing's something that we've seen a lot of, isn't it? That the discussion around lack of resource, lack of skill potentially, and of course then this idea of, but I keep buying security tools. Is this ever going to get better? And you mentioned as well in your kind of introduction about EDR, detection and response. And that feels like has been quite a significant shift. This idea of detection and response technology, moving away from tools that just kind of give you bits of information to tools that maybe look to bring that kind of stuff together. So, kind of detection and response is a big part of what you do at Sophos.
Mm-hmm.
So is there? How have you seen that change? How have you seen the adoption of that grow? How is that kind of whole space evolving to try and solve some of the challenges you talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of good things to unpick there. The first one you touched on.
I love a long question, Stephen, to be fair.
It's good.
Yeah.
Let's see how much of it I remember. The first one is around the adversaries attacking. We have an active adversary report that Sophos puts out. So, I'd encourage anyone watching to go off and look at that. It's on the Sophos news site. And John Shire, who did the report, investigated all of the data that we had into our managed detection response team, and found, not surprising, but it's always good to validate that attacks were out of hours. So as you say, in the evenings and at the weekends. And the reason being, it's when the people in the security operations centers, the people who are looking at this data coming in, aren't there candidly looking at what's coming in. So the first thing is, who's managing out of hours? So there is the tools that you can put in place, as you touched on. How it's evolved, typically these are disparate tools. So on average, there was a report I was reading the other week around security tool consolidation. And it's great that, people are looking at how they can consolidate their security tools, because that makes it easier to ingest and review that data. Whilst it's a good endeavor, the average number was 7 to 10 tools. So there's still 7 to 10 tools. And if they're disparate tools and they're not communicating with each other, you've got a number of different systems you then have to look at. So you've got the challenge of who's managing the different tools, who's managing it out of hours, and what do you do with that data when you actually have it? Alert fatigue is very common in the industry. Do you have the context? Have you got the correlation? So if you have something from, say, your identity solution, how do you tie that back to the user who's on the endpoint? And are there any signals from the endpoint that you ought to correlate with that identity? So I mentioned EDR, and from an industry standpoint, how we're addressing this is XDR. So the X in the DR is for extended detection response. And really, at a simple level, that means taking in security telemetry from the different range of products across your estate. So think about endpoint in EDR, then you add in the concept of your email, your firewall, network security, identity, as I mentioned. So if you can pull all of these security telemetry sources into a single platform, an XDR platform, that then helps with the contextualization and correlation to start to make sense of data that's coming in from these multiple sources.
That's actually a really good phrase there. You actually just talked about kind of making sense of it. Because I was going to ask that, well, probably a two-parter. One is, people listening to this might go, oh, XDR, is that just another tool that I need to buy? I've already got 7 to 10 tools, and I think you've been kind with 7 to 10. I think, I've seen figures that talk about 40, 50, 60 different kind of IT security tools. But let's go with 7 to 10, So are people thinking, well, XDR is just another one that I've got to go and have a look at? But also that idea of, what about things like SIM tools where you are already pulling all those logs into different places? How does XDR maybe specifically, what's different? How's that different?
Yeah, it's good. So XDR really focuses on the security telemetry. I think there's a couple of different. So in the industry, XDR is fairly well understood now. There are different approaches though that we see. So there's an evolution of EDR to XDR as people realize the need to go beyond the endpoint, as we mentioned. Certainly from a Sophos perspective, with our XDR, it's about bringing data in and making the most of your current investments. So 8 9 years ago nearly now, we launched synchronized security. And that was where the Sophos endpoint and the Sophos firewall could share data and provide better security outcomes. And that's still something that we use today. But what we realized was that if you've already invested in another firewall product, how can we ensure that from an XDR perspective, you still get the best security outcomes? How can you make sense of that data? And so ingesting data from third-party firewalls into our platform, and then what's critical is doing the normalization so that the contextualization and correlation makes sense, whether your source IP address is called something different in one vendor versus another. And what this allows is when we think of the analyst then sitting in the security operations center, they're not having to try and understand different data coming in from different firewall vendors versus endpoint data where the IP address may be called something slightly different again. So bringing in the data from those sources into XDR and making the most of your current investments is how we see XDR really taking hold. EDR, as I mentioned, evolving into XDR, bringing in other data sources.
So what kind of data sources can you use? So where can you, because you've touched on endpoint, so EDR, endpoint detection and response. You've touched on firewalls. Where else can you kind of pull telemetry in from? Because I think one of the things that was interesting, what you were saying kind of in the introduction about all of these tools. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that I always try to talk to kind of decision makers around is the more of these tools that you have, potentially the more gaps that there are between them. And it was interesting you talking about that kind of Sophos synchronization between endpoints and firewall, just trying to close some of those gaps. So, so what other kind of places can you pull that information from?
Yeah, so there's a number of good categories. So endpoint and firewall, obviously very key, as you mentioned. Email, identity, alongside network. So if you think of we at Sophos, we have an NDR appliance. There are other vendors that have network tools out there. So looking at traffic volumes and patterns and being able to spot, one of the big changes we saw in our active adversary report that people that go and look at it will see is around data exfiltration. So a network's a key one where you can spot those anomalies. And again, it's really about that trigger to then go off and investigate. The other thing, going back to one of your previous questions, when we think about all these different sources, if we think of your typical customer now, you need someone who can not only manage the data coming from those sources, but make sense of it. So lots of us will have the endpoint girl at the office who's responsible to deploy the software on the endpoints, set up the policies, and respond to the alerts that come in from your endpoint vendor. We now expect that same person to understand information coming in from AWS, from public cloud, understand logs coming in from your identity provider, from your firewall. Firewall's a completely different beast, obviously. And so it now becomes that ongoing challenge of not only making sense of it, but who's going to make sense of it when you think about multiple sources. And so one of the solutions there is managed XDR, or from a Sophos perspective, MDR. So this is where you can extend your existing investments in your security operations center and then have people working with you in different modes within Sophos, for example, to help you where there is something that needs investigation, or where, should it happen, an investigation becomes an incident. And just to touch briefly on how we approach that is, there's a collaboration mode where, as you mentioned, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5:30, the team can be taking care of investigations and making sense of data that's coming into the system. But when you clock up at 5:30, you know that you're handing over to the Sophos team who are going to keep doing that proactive monitoring, but also are able to then respond. We can notify you if there's a response that needs to take place. You can page someone at 3:00 in the morning on a Saturday if the worst happens and there is an attack. But that's something that lots of customers are looking at and talking to us about is how do we extend our security operations center into those hours in which we don't have the funds to source the skills required for a security analyst. They're expensive. There's a skill shortage. And where we do, we don't have the infrastructure to run that 24/7. We're a fairly small organization, but we understand that there is a need to have this ongoing monitoring 24/7, 365.
So just to step back slightly into something, because there's a couple of things there. We're doing a lot of unpicking of each other's answers here, but so there's a couple of things there that I'll come back to. But just step back. We introduced this episode as looking at how to make the most out of your existing security tool investments, but obviously we're starting this now by talking about yet another security tool. So are we talking about, that, so somebody listening to this and saying, well, I've just spent a fortune and now what you're asking me to do is replace it with something else. How on earth do I justify it? Are we asking them to do that, or are we able to add value to the stuff that's already there?
Yeah, exactly. It's a great question. So the endpoint or the point solutions that customers have really come together. If you think of XDR more as the platform, so that's where you pull in all of the data sources. That's where we do the contextualization and correlation. And so that investment is really looking at how you can consolidate your time into one tool. So it's really thinking about, it's the investment to make the most of your existing investments in the security tools that you have.
And is this kind of addressing, so one of the problems, you mentioned the phrase alert fatigue a couple of times, and one of the challenges that I see, because there are other ways that we can consolidate lots of logs together and try and analyze them. A SIM tool is the obvious thing. So whether that's a Microsoft Sentinel or the Splunk or whatever it might be, we're aggregating lots of these things together. But I suppose one of the challenges I see with that is actually this element of you still need to understand the thing that you're looking at, and digging through that and correlating all those bits together. You've used a phrase before about kind of normalizing that information. Are you seeing, is that, firstly, is that a driver behind this idea of detection response? Because my view of detection response is that, whereas a SIM tool is there to present information to you for you to go and act upon, my view of detection as response is actually it takes that, doesn't necessarily keep it for as long, so it keeps what's relevant, but can act on that information on your behalf almost. So I suppose is that the gap we're kind of filling with detection and response? Maybe is a starting question.
Yeah, I think that's it's a good way to phrase it. Is so the SIM tools, they're taking in a plethora of log data, not just the security telemetry. And I think it's fair to say that if you have people that understand that data that's coming in, they can create views, dashboards, queries to then go and look for that anomalous behavior. Whereas the XDR platform is really focused on your security tooling and the detections that are generated from that tool already. So it's shortcutting the work that you would do from a SIM perspective, as you alluded to say, we believe this to be a suspicious activity. Now, I mentioned at the start, we're still obsessive about protection. The key thing from a detection and response platform like Sophos XDR is where that detection comes in, it's given a severity score. You can choose how to act. Some of the response has already been taken. If you think about anti-ransomware products, they will roll back affected files to their known good state. If you think about malware, that malware gets quarantined, it gets removed from the device. It means that it can't do anything untoward on the systems. But all of these are indicators that you will want to go and investigate. So I gave the example earlier, that piece of malware that was seen on this device, is it elsewhere? Is it residing in a mailbox but yet to be opened? That ransomware that was rolled back, is there an adversary on my estate looking at the next chink in the armor? Are they looking to disable my endpoint protection product like Sophos so that I can rerun the ransomware and actually encrypt? If the ransomware has failed, are they now exfiltrating data? So how do I go to my network logs and see if there's anomalous behavior in the amount of data that's been leaked out of the system? So it's really, for me, about how we, the detection response piece, your question is acting on those detections, be they suspicious or malicious, to aid the investigation to allow us to take either automated or manual response.
Yeah, and it feels like that correlation of that activity is a really important part, because I've worked on a couple of we did one of our tech takeaways podcasts about this recently, actually looking at almost that anatomy of an attack, and often what you'll see when you go back and do the incident investigation is there's been lots of signs of that attack coming, so lots of, observation going on, that kind of reconnaissance on a network. You've seen points where maybe accounts have been compromised, but the gap is that nobody's correlating that information together. And it's only after the fact, when you've almost seen the result of that you start to go back and think, well, based on the result, these things must have happened, and then you almost find the evidence for those things happening. So is that kind of that correlation a big value add from an XDR point of view? So for addressing some of those gaps.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few key phrases we talked about. Context is one, and correlation. So if we focus first of all on the protection standpoint, certainly one of the advancements at Sophos, the adaptive attack protection that we've launched recently, is how do you adapt your protection based on the context of the system? So you gave the example there of an account compromise. Let's imagine a new user account gets created on a device. Now, if I was to alert you to that fact or even block that from happening, it would get very frustrating very quickly. You're trying to create a new user, it's a new starter, and that's part of the normal operation. If you have the context because of the other indicators you touched on from the machine, that there's something suspicious going on, you can suddenly now say, in the context of what I've seen happening on this machine, that registry key change or that new user account creation is now going from being normal behavior to being suspicious. And now I'll actually put the shields up and actually take different approach to my protection. And the same is true for detection and response. So where we then have the detection to say we've now seen, for example, a process has reached out to a known command and control site, and that's our trigger, it's going back and doing what we call attack chaining to go and look at those previous indicators and pull them together to have that context to say, actually, whilst the trigger was that connection to the command and control site that we've stopped, we now have that context. We can go back and correlate and say, this all started when this user account was created, this registry key was run, the machine was booted into safe mode, and then the attacker tried to connect to the command and control. The reason that's really important is from an investigation standpoint, I now can go and look for those indicators elsewhere across my environment. I also know where the adversary is. I know they've tried to connect to this command and control site, so I can go and look for that IP address in my firewall. And if we think back to the X and XDR, I now have my firewall log, so it's much easier for me in my investigation to see if the IP address has been seen elsewhere. And it ultimately makes response easier. I know what I need to do to clean up. I know, if the tools in my arsenal from a security standpoint have automatically blocked that command and control site, we've automatically added that IP address to my perimeter firewalls, I then know the bits that I have to do manually. And manually might be removing that compromised account from Active Directory, manually but might be removing that registry key. So absolutely, that's where XDR really comes together to correlate information that otherwise would lead to alert fatigue, but also aids the investigation. So the analyst, be it an analyst within your team or an analyst within a managed service, is able to reduce, can't believe we've made it this long into our chat and I've not covered mean time to detect, investigate and respond. When you look at, industry average, we talk about response times in the multiple hours. With the Sophos MDR team, we continually monitor response times, and we're seeing 38 minutes as a mean time to respond because of the correlation and context that we're able to add to those detections.
Yeah, and that's kind of against an average of inside of an organization, trying to do this kind of stuff yourself without the help of technology. That potentially that is, we go from 38 minutes to being 38, 72, 90 odd hours worth of, days of, and there's so much damage that could be done, because often with cybersecurity incidents, of course, speed is of the essence. That detection and response and mitigation is hugely important. So, all this sounds great. These are things that, you'd be thinking, well, surely everybody's doing these kind of things. But what are some of the, so for, anybody in a decision-making position looking at their IT security stack at the moment, thinking, well, okay, I like the idea of correlating stuff together. I'd like the idea of maybe automating some of my responses. When you go and talk to somebody, what are the use cases that you see? What are the maybe the obvious big challenges that somebody's trying to deal with where XDR is really a good fit? And I warn you in advance, I'm going to ask you a question about where it's not a good fit as well. So just to prep you for that.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, but from a from a decision maker's point of view, where is XDR really a good fit? What is that problem that those kind of key problems you're going to solve?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing to understand is where the customer is on their cybersecurity journey. So we talked about maturity earlier on. There are some customers who have that maturity when it comes to cybersecurity. They have teams. They're already running a security operations center within their organization, be it due to their size or the industry they're in. And where we see that, it's really about having conversations I touched on earlier about where are their current investments across their security tool set and how are they managing those investments. And as we talked about, XDR then means we're bringing those investments together into one platform. And so that's the conversation we're typically having there. Where we follow on to maybe preempt that is the SIM replacement conversation. We can come back to that. But really, XDR conversations in those environments is about consolidation of their investments into that single platform, and the conversation we just had about the analyst efficiencies that we realize by having that contextualization correlation, improving the mean time to detect, investigate, and respond. However, typically the conversation is candidly with less cybersecurity mature organizations. So it starts really at where are you in your journey from an endpoint perspective? And many people are still in a protection-only mode. And this harks back to, as I touched on, the set and forget nature of, if I'm paying a vendor like Sophos for protection, they will take care of it. And that mindset's, fine. We will block the ransomware and roll back affected files. If we see malicious content, it gets quarantined. We have all of these layers of protection. So why do I need to do anything more? I've still got the policy set up. I get my email if something, Stephen goes and downloads that suspicious file. Everything's taken care of. And the reason we need to talk to these customers and the realization for, as we talked about EDR, is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the adversaries becoming ever smarter, attacks becoming ever more sophisticated. And so in that scenario, our conversation really candidly focuses on the EDR element of XDR, which is how can you get your endpoints so that they're doing more than just protection? And what we mean by more than just protection is it's that suspicion. As I mentioned, Sophos can't block new account creation. It'd be too noisy. If a new executable is introduced to a device, we wouldn't want to block it. But that might be an indicator that there is an adversary that's trying to use living off the land binaries, for example, is actually using tools already on the machine in order to move laterally. With an EPP, an endpoint protection product, none of those would trigger that email to the admin to say there's something malicious going on. And so the conversation really starts about moving into the endpoint detection response to give you A, that broader visibility, but B, as we talked about, the correlation to allow them to actually then go and take their own response. They understand their environment best of all. So if there's something suspicious going on, they'll quickly know whether or not it is something nefarious that needs investigation or not. And once you've had that conversation, the natural follow-on is, this is great. We're talking about how I can bring my endpoint data in and I can see that extra level of suspicion. What do I now do about my firewall, my network, my other security investments? And that's why the industry as a whole, we're seeing this move from EDR to XDR, and why at Sophos, an investment in Sophos XDR includes endpoint for EDR, whether that's a Sophos endpoint or a third-party endpoint product. And it also includes, productivity suites around Microsoft and Google, because they're things that everyone's using today. You can then layer on top of that third parties as customers realize the need to introduce data from other security tools into the platform.
So there's a whole bunch of other questions I wanted to ask you, but I'm aware we're coming to the end of our time, because as we mentioned in the beginning, you've managed to squeeze in between important customer conversations and important conversations with your CEO. So all good, by the way. So I don't think this is a CV generating event, this conversation, but you touched on something kind of briefly before, and I think it's a really important part of this kind of conversation for somebody who's making decisions around the kind of technology investments they make. You mentioned kind of SIM replacement. Maybe to extend on that rather than just SIM replacement, how are you seeing, what do people need to think about in terms of kind of the scale of investment that you're going to need for XDR? So I don't mean how much does XDR cost, but in terms of, how you potentially go about paying for this, either in savings, in efficiencies, in replacement of other tools, maybe. Is there any kind of commonality in what you see in how people pay for this?
Yeah, I think that the main one is, as you touched on, is around the efficiencies. It's the consolidation of multiple different, management tools, etc., and allowing that focus of time. So again, the mean time to detect, investigate, and respond is obviously much shorter, which is one saving. But also by allowing, if you're already invested in security analysts, for example, the investments you make in them you recognize savings because they're dealing with one platform in which we're pulling in all of the data. You're no longer dealing with 6, 7 different management consoles. So a lot of the savings come in there, and that's really how we see, payments being made. The other angle, and you touched on a follow-on question around where it's not a good fit, is candidly where you don't have the skill set in-house to self-manage. Now, that's not saying, an XDR platform isn't needed, but that's where we then layer on top a managed service.
Yeah, because you still need the skill set and understanding of what XDR is telling you.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's either through a partner, vendors have their own, like, Sophos has their own managed detection and response service. And the savings there come about, as I touched on earlier. I don't have to now go and hire security analysts. I don't have to spin up an operations center, and I don't have to worry about how I manage that out of hours. So again, the savings there are around recognizing the current investments you've made in your security tool set, but realizing that by offloading the burden of the security operations center to a partner, you can recognize savings that you'd otherwise incur through analysts.
And I think that touches on kind of maybe as a couple of final points. I suppose that touched on something quite interesting in terms of, we're not necessarily saying you should replace your security analyst and just leave it to the technology. I was with a CISO of a very big, well-known organization earlier in the week. It was a bit of a random meeting. I won't bore you in the audience with how I got there. But one of the things they were talking around about their investment in MDR was the idea that what it allowed them to do, because their concern with MDR was that it meant, with the best will in the world, it doesn't matter how good your provider is, they're still not in your business day to day working on your problems with all the nuances that come with it. So when there's a response, actually the very best people that you need are probably people you employ. But if you let them all go, so what they talked about was what they'd seen with their MDR investment was twofold. One was it allowed the platform and the service provider for a commercially attractive cost. I'm not saying it was relatively low cost, but commercially it kind of worked out. And it allowed that to do a lot of the kind of the heavy lifting, a lot of that grunt work, dealing with some of the things you've talked about, those signals, day-to-day attacks that are relatively easy for then the platform with a bit of human intelligence maybe added as well, to kind of automate and deal with that. And what it allowed them to do with their expert investment was to put that investment into 2-3 people who were real experts, but their focus was going to be that really complicated stuff. It was going to be that next kind of thing. And I thought it was a really smart way of looking at an MDR investment. I mean, is that, so and it's a bit of a two-parter, but one, we're not talking about replacing your internal skill. And is that kind of approach something that you're seeing, being able to redeploy your expensive resource a lot of the time, being able to redeploy them into way more efficient, way more cost-effective roles and tasks?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So absolutely, you've invested in an analyst, as you say, they understand your business, your environment. It's really about making them focused on the more important stuff that matters. And there's 2 elements there. One is the proactive nature. So if they're not dealing with the day-to-day escalations as they're coming in, fairly simple investigations in which you can mark it as benign, or it was a true positive, the response has taken care of it, and we've done our investigation. There's no signs that there's an adversary, and we can move on. When we talk about security operations, we typically talk about tier 1, 2, and 3. And what we do with an investment in MDR is we allow our existing investment in analysts to then go and focus more on the tier 3 elements. And your MDR team are dealing more with the tier 1 and 2. So yes, you're freeing up that investment to go and work on the more complex problems to solve, or allowing them to be more proactive in your defense. And a proactive defense is obviously very important. It's very difficult to do if they're dealing with the day-to-day. And so sharing that burden and having a shoulder of a security operations center who are dealing not only out of hours, but as I mentioned earlier, they're collaborating with your in-house experts. And that's what's really key.
So I think that's a great point, and that idea of using that expertise efficiently makes a lot of sense. So, well, I think as we kind of come to the end of our time here, maybe one kind of final wrap up question for you then. So, as a bit of advice for kind of our CTOs who, and decision makers who are watching the show, is there anything that you would suggest them if they're considering XDR, or they've decided they want to implement XDR even? Is there a tip that you would give them to to help them make sure that their XDR adoption, their XDR process is something that's the right thing for them, and things to avoid, make sure they avoid making, kind of the number one mistake that you see. What's a top tip for somebody considering or about to adopt XDR?
Yeah, I think for me, the top tip is looking at the tools that you can integrate with the XDR platform. And the reason I mention that, there are different approaches in the industry. There's open XDR platforms, there's closed platforms, and there's hybrid. And so if those CTOs, CISOs listening, go and investigate which security tools you have. Let's see whether it was the 7 to 10 I mentioned, or as you suggested, possibly more. And then think about an XDR platform that will allow them to make the most of their existing investments. They don't want to have to go and rip out their firewalls just to have a better security outcome. The cost incurred, the retraining of staff, etc., is a burden that they won't want to have. Whereas if they can take their existing investments, but move from hopefully EDR today, hopefully everyone listening is already managing EDR, but if not, move from endpoint protection into XDR, but by taking and making the most of their current cybersecurity investments. That'd be my top tip.
Yeah, and I think I echo that. I think that's a really, smart approach. Is to possibly understand where the gaps are and understand what you actually want from whether it's XDR or a managed version of. Understand, and when I mentioned the CISO I was talking to, one of the things they talked about, which I thought was really interesting, was that if you're going to use a managed detection and response service, understand what you want it to do. And then don't try and work with an MDR vendor who doesn't do the thing that you want. Find one that does, because everybody's requirements are a little bit different. But MDR solutions, like any managed solution, and like XDR to a degree as well, they do what they do. Don't come to them and say, "Oh, by the way, do you mind customizing it for me?" Because understand what you want, understand that the tools you've got. So I think that's a great tip. So, well, Stephen, look, this has been great. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
I know I've caught you on a particularly busy day, so thanks for dropping into the studio to do this. So, but that's been great. So thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
If you've enjoyed the show and you want to make sure you catch future CTO Insights, and do subscribe. You can subscribe here on YouTube, or you can subscribe in all good homes of podcasts. But until next time, thanks for watching.